to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, my darlings. Today I bring you a story from H.G. Wells. The Star. It was on the first day of the new year that the announcement was made, almost simultaneously from 3 observatories, that the motion of the planet Neptune, the outermost of all the planets that wheeled about the sun, had become erratic. Ogilvy had already called attention to a suspected retardation of its velocity in December. Such a piece of news was scarcely calculated to interest the world, the greater portion of whose inhabitants were unaware of the existence of the planet Neptune. Nor outside the astronomical profession did the subsequent discovery of a faint, remote speck of light in the region of the perturbed planet cause any great excitement. Scientific people, however, found the intelligence remarkable enough, even before it became known that the new body was rapidly growing larger and brighter, that its motion was quite different from the orderly progress of the planets, and that the deflection of Neptune and its satellites was becoming now of an unprecedented kind. Few people without training in science can realize the huge isolation of the solar system. The sun, with its speck of planets, its dust of planetoids, and its incompatible comets, swim in vacant immensity that almost defeats the imagination. Beyond the orbit of Neptune, there is space, vacant so far as human observation has penetrated, without warmth or light or sound, blank emptiness for 12 billion times a million miles. That is the smallest estimate of the distance to be traversed before the nearest of the stars is attained, and, saving a few comets, more unsubstantial than the thinnest flame, no matter had ever, to human knowledge, crossed the gulf of space. Until early in the 20th century, this wanderer appeared. A vast mass of matter it was, bulky, heavy, rushing without warning out of the black mystery of the sky into the radiance of the sun. By the second day, it was clearly visible to any decent instrument as a speck with barely sensible diameter in the constellation Leo near Regulus. In a little while, an opera glass could attain it. On the 3rd day of the new year, the newspaper readers of 2 hemispheres were made aware, for the first time, of the real importance of this unusual apparition in the heavens. "A planetary collision," one London paper headed the news, and proclaimed Dulcine's opinion that this strange new planet would probably collide with Neptune. The leader writers enlarged upon the topic, so that in most of the capitals of the world, on January 3rd, there was an expectation, however vague, of some imminent phenomenon in the sky. And as the night followed the sunset round the globe, thousands of men turned their eyes skyward to see the old familiar stars, just as they had always been, until it was dawn in London and Pollux setting, and the stars overhead grown pale. The winter's dawn it was, a sickly filtering accumulation of daylight, and the light of gas and candles shone yellow in the windows to show where people were astir. But the yawning policeman saw the thing. A busy crowds in the market stopped, agape, workmen going to their work betimes, milkmen, the drivers of the new carts, dissipation going home jaded and pale, homeless wanderers, sentinels on their beat, and in the country, laborers trudging afield, poachers slinking home, all over the dusky, quickening country, it would be seen, and out at sea, by seamen watching for the day, a great white star come suddenly into the western sky. Brighter it was than any star in our skies, brighter than the evening star at its brightest. It still glowed out white and large, no mere twinkling spot of light, but a small, round, clear shining disk, an hour after the day had come, and where science had not reached, men stared and feared, telling one another of the wars and pestilence that foreshadowed by these fiery signs in the heaven. Sturdy Boers, dusky Hottentots, Gold Coast natives, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, stood in the glow of the sunrise watching the setting of this strange new star. And in 100 observatories there had been suppressed excitement, rising almost to shouting pitch, as the two remote bodies had rushed together. There had been a hurrying to and fro to gather photographic apparatus and spectroscope, to gather this appliance and that, to record the novel, astonishing sight, the destruction of a world, for it was a world, a sister planet to our Earth, far greater than our Earth indeed, that had so suddenly flashed into flaming death. Neptune it was, which had been struck fairly and squarely by the planet from outer space, and the heat of the concussion had incontinentally turned two solid globs into one vast mass of incandescence. Round the world that day, 2 hours before the dawn, went the pallid great white star, fading only as it sank westward and the sun mounted above it. Everywhere man marveled at it, but of all those who saw it, none could have marveled more than those sailors, habitual watchers of the stars, who far away at sea had heard nothing of its advent, and saw it now rise like a pygmy moon, and climb zenithward, and hang overhead, and sink westward with the passing of the night. And when next it rose over Europe, everywhere were crowds of watchers on hilly slopes, on house roofs, in open spaces, staring eastward, waiting for the rise of the new star. It rose with a white glow in front, like the glare of a white fire, and those who had seen it coming into existence the night before cried out at the sight of it. "It's larger," they cried. "It's brighter." And indeed the moon, a quarter full and sinking in the west, was in its apparent size beyond comparison, but scarcely, in all of its breadth, had it as much brightness now as the little circle of light in the strange new star. "It's brighter," cried the people clustering in the streets. But in the dim observatories the watchers held their breath and peered at one another. "It's nearer," they said, "nearer." And voice after voice repeated, "It is nearer." And the clicking telegraph took that up, and its trembling along the phone wires and in 1,000 cities. Grimy compositors fingered in the type. "It is nearer." Men writing in offices, struck with strange realization, flung down their pens. Men taking up 1,000 places suddenly came upon a grotesque possibility in those words. "It is nearer." It hurried along awkward streets. It was shouted down in the frost-stilled ways of quiet villages. Men who had read these things from the throbbing tape stood in yellow-lit doorways, shouting the news to passers-by. "It's nearer." Pretty women, flushing and glittering, heard the news told jestingly between dances, and feigned an intelligent interest they did not feel. Nearer indeed. How curious, how clever people must be to find out things like that. Lonely tramps, faring through the wintry night, murmured those words to comfort themselves, looking skyward. "It has to be nearer, for the night's as cold as charity. Don't see much warmth from it, if it is nearer all the same." "What is a new star to me?" cried the weeping woman kneeling beside her dead. The schoolboy rising early for his examination work, puzzled it out for himself, with the great white star shining broad and bright through the frost flowers of his window. Centrifugal, centripetal, he said with his chin on his fist. Stop a planet in its flight, rob it of its centrifugal force, then what? Centripetal has it, and down it falls into the sun. And this... Do we come in the way, I wonder? The light of that day went the way of its brethren, and with the latter watches of the frosty darkness rose the strange star again, and it was now so bright that the waxing moon seemed but a pale yellow ghost of itself. Rising huge in the sunset hour, in the South African city a great man had married, and the streets were alight to welcome his return with his bride. Even the skies have illuminated, said the flatterer. Under Capricorn, two lovers, daring the wild beasts and evil spirits, for love of one another, crouched together in a canebrake, where the fireflies hovered. That is our star, they whispered, and felt strangely comforted by the sweet brilliancy of its light. The master mathematician sat in his private room and pushed the papers from him. His calculations were already finished in a small white file. There still remained a little of the drug that had kept him awake and active for 4 long nights. Each day, serene, explicit, patient as ever, he had given his lecture to his students, and then had come back at once to his momentous calculations. His face was grave, a little drawn and hectic from his drugged activity. For some time he seemed lost in thought. Then he went to the window, and the blind went up with a click. Halfway up, the sky over the clustering roofs, chimneys, and steeples of the city hung the star. He looked at it as one might look into the eye of a brave enemy. "You may kill me," he said after a silence, "but I can hold you, and all of the universe for that matter, in the grip of this little brain. I would not change, even now." He looked at the little file. There was no need of sleep again, he said. The next day at noon, punctual to the minute, he entered his lecture theater, put his hat on the end of the table, as his habit was, and carefully selected a large piece of chalk. It was a joke among his students that he could not lecture without that piece of chalk to fumble in his fingers, and once he had been stricken to impotence by their hiding his supply, he came and looked under his gray eyebrows at the rising tiers of young, fresh faces, and spoke with his accustomed studied commonness of phrasing. "Circumstances have arisen. Circumstances beyond my control," he said, and paused, "which will debar me from completing the course I had designed. It would seem, gentlemen, if I may put the thing clearly and briefly, that man has lived in vain." The students glanced at one another. Had they heard aright? Mad. Raised eyebrows and grinning lips there were, but 1 or 2 faces remained intent upon his gray, calm, infringed face. "It will be interesting," he was saying, "to devote the morning to an exposition, so far as I can make it clear to you. The calculations have led me to this conclusion. Let us assume—" He turned towards the blackboard, mediating a diagram in the way that was usual for him. "What was that about lived in vain?" whispered one student to another. "Listen," said the other, nodding towards the lecturer. And presently they began to understand. That night the star rose later for its proper eastward motion, and carried it some way across Leo towards Virgo, and its brightness was so great that the sky became a luminous blue as it rose, and every star and planet was hidden, save only Jupiter near the zenith. Apella, Aldebaran, Sirius, and the pointers of the Bear. It was white and beautiful. In many parts of the world that night, a pallid halo encircled about it. it was perceptibly larger. In the clear, refractive sky of the tropics, it seemed as if it were nearly a quarter the size of the moon. The frost was still on the ground in England, but the world was brightly lit, as if it were midsummer moonlight. One could see to read quite ordinary print by that cold, clear light, and the cities, the lamps burned yellow and wan. And everywhere the world was awake that night, and throughout Christendom a sombre murmur hung in the keen air over the countryside, like the buzzing of bees in the heather. And this murmurous tumult grew to a clangor in the cities. It was the tolling of bells in a million belfry towers and steeples, summoning the people to sleep no more, to sin no more, but to gather in their churches and pray. And overhead, growing larger and brighter as the earth rolled on its way, and the night passed, rose the dazzling star. And the streets and houses were alight in all the cities. The shipyards glared, and whatever roads led to high country were lit and crowded all night long. And in all the seas, about the civilized lands, ships with throbbing engines, and ships with bellying sails, crowded with men and living creatures, were standing out to the ocean and the north. For already the warning of the master mathematician had been telegraphed over the earth and translated into 100 tongues. The new planet and Neptune, locked in a fiery embrace, were whirling headlong, ever faster and faster towards the sun. Already, every second, this blazing mass flew 100 miles, and every second its terrific velocity increased. As it flew its course, it must pass 100 millions of miles wide of the earth and scarcely affect it. But near its distant path, as yet only slightly perturbed, spun the mighty planet Jupiter and his moons, sweeping splendidly around the sun. Every moment now the attraction between the fiery star and the greatest of planets grew stronger, and the result of that attraction? Inevitably, Jupiter would be deflected from its orbit into a new elliptical path, and the burning star swung by his attraction, wide of its sunward rush, would describe a curved path, and perhaps collide with, and certainly pass close to, our Earth. Earthquakes, volcanic outbreaks, cyclones, sea waves, floods, and a steady rise in temperature to know not what limit, so prophesied the master mathematician. And overhead, to carry out his words, lonely and cold and livid, blazed the star of the coming doom. To many who stared at it that night until their eyes ached, it seemed that it was visibly approaching. And that night, too, the weather changed, and the frost had gripped all of Central Europe, and France and England softened towards a thaw. But you must not imagine, because I have spoken of people praying through the night, and people going aboard ships, and people fleeing towards mountainous country, that the whole world was already in a terror because of the star. As a matter of fact, use and wont still ruled the world, and save for the talk of idle moments and the splendor of the night, 9 human beings out of 10 were still busy at their common occupations. In all the cities, the shops, save one here and there, opened and closed at their proper hour. The doctor and the undertaker plied their trades, and workers gathered in the factories. Soldiers drilled, scholars studied, lovers sought one another, thieves lurked and fled, politicians planned their schemes. The presses of the newspaper roared through the night, and many of the priests of this church and that would not open his holy building to further what he considered a foolish panic. The newspapers insisted on the lesson of the year 1000, for then, too, people had anticipated the end. The star was no star, mere gas, a comet. And were it a star, it could not possibly strike the earth. There was no precedent for such a thing. Common sense was sturdy everywhere, scornful, jesting, a little inclined to persecute the obdurate fearful. That night at 7:15 by Greenwich time, the star would be at its nearest to Jupiter. Then the world would see the turn things would take. The master mathematician's grim warnings were treated by many as so much mere elaborated self-advertisement. Common sense at last, a little heated by argument, signified an unalterable conviction by going to bed. So, too, barbarism and savagery, already tired of the novelty, went about their nightly business, and save for a howling dog here and there, the beast world left the star unheeded. And yet, when at last the watchers in the European states saw their star rise an hour later, it is true, but no larger than it had been the night before, there was still plenty awake to laugh at the master mathematician, to take the danger as if it had passed. But hereafter the laughter ceased. The star grew. It grew with a terrible steadiness, hour after hour, a little larger each hour, a little nearer the midnight zenith, and brighter, until it had turned night into day. Had it come straight to the earth instead of the curved path? Had it lost no velocity to Jupiter? It must have leapt the intervening gulf in the day. But as it was, it took 5 days altogether to come by our planet. The next night it had become a third the size of the moon before it set to the English eyes, and the thaw was assured. It rose over America nearly the size of the moon, but blinding white to look at, and hot, and breath of hot wind blew now with its rising and gathering strength, and in Virginia and Brazil, and down the St. Lawrence Valley, it shone intermittently through a driving reek of thunderclouds, flickering violet lightning, and hail unprecedented. In Manitoba, there were a thaw and devastating floods, and upon the mountains of the earth the snow and ice began to melt that night, and all the rivers coming out of the high country flowed thick and turbid, and soon, in their upper reaches, with swirling trees and bodies of beasts and men, they rose steadily in the ghostly brilliance, and came trickling over their banks at last, behind the flying population of their valleys, and along the coast of Argentina, and up the South Atlantic tides, were higher than they had ever been in the memory of man, and the storms drove the waters, in many cases, scores of miles inland, drowning whole cities, and so great grew the heat during the night that the rising of the sun was like the coming of a shadow. The earthquakes began and grew until all down America, from the Arctic Circle to Cape Horn hillside, were sliding, fissures were opening, and houses and walls crumbling to destruction. China was lit glowing white, but over Japan and Java and all the islands of Eastern Asia, the great star was a ball of dull red fire because of the steam and smoke and ashes the volcanoes were spouting forth to salute its coming. Above were the lava, hot gas, and ashes, and below the seething floods, and the whole earth swayed and rumbled with the earthquake shocks. Soon the immemorial snows of Tibet and Himalayas were melting and pouring down by 10 million deep and converging channels upon the plains of Burma and Hindustan. The tangled summits of the Indian jungle were aflame in 1,000 places, and below the hurrying waters, around the stems, were dark objects that struggled feebly and reflected the blood-red tongues of fire. And, in an ungovernable confusion, a multitude of men and women fled down the broad river to that one last hope of men, the open sea. Larger grew the star, and larger, hotter, and brighter, with terrible swiftness now. The tropical ocean had lost its phosphorescence, and the swirling steam rose in ghostly wreaths from the black waves that plunged incessantly, speckled with storm-tossed ships. And then came a wonder. It seemed to those who were in Europe, watched for the rising of the star, that the world must have ceased its rotation. In 1,000 open spaces of down and upland, the people who had fled thither from the floods and the falling houses and sliding slopes of hill watched for that rise in vain. Hour followed hour through terrible suspense, and the star rose not. Once again men set their eyes upon the old constellations they had counted lost to them forever. In England it was hot and clear overhead, though the ground quivered perpetually. But in the tropical Ceres and Capella and Aldebaran showed through a veil of steam. And when at last the great star rose, nearly 10 hours later, the sun rose close upon it, and in the center of its white heart was a disk of black. Over Asia, the star had begun to fall behind the movement of the sky. And then suddenly, as it hung over India, its light had been veiled. All the plains of India, from the mouth of the Indus to the mouths of the Ganges, was a shallow waste of shining water that night, out of which rose temples and palaces, mounds and hills, black with people. Every minaret was clustering masses of people who fell one by one into the turbid waters as heat and terror overcame them. The whole land seemed a wailing, and suddenly there swept a shadow across the furnace of despair, and a breath of cold wind and a gathering of clouds out of the cooling air. Men looked up, nearly blind as the star, and saw the black disk creeping across the light. It was the moon, coming between the star and the earth, and even as men cried to God at this respite, out of the east, with a strange, inexplicable swiftness, sprang the sun. And then star, sun, and moon rushed together across the heavens. So it was presently. To the European watchers, star and sun rose close upon each other, drove headlong for a space, and then slower, and at last came to rest, star and sun merging into one glare of flame at the zenith of the sky. The moon no longer eclipsed the star, but was lost to sight in the brilliance of the sky, and those who were still alive regarded it, for the most part, with the dull stupidity that hunger, fatigue, heat, and despair engender. There were still men who could perceive the meaning of these signs. Star and earth had been their nearest, and had swung about one another, and the star had passed. Already it was receding swifter and swifter in the last stage of its headlong journey downward into the sun. And then the clouds gathered, blotting out the vision of the sky. The thunder and lightning wove a garment around the world. All over the earth was such a downpour of rain as men had never seen before. And where the volcanoes flared red against the cloud canopy, there descended torrents of mud. Everywhere the waters were pouring off the land, leaving mud, stilled, ruined, and the earth littered like a storm-worn beach with all that had floated, and the dead bodies of men and brutes, its children. For days the water streamed off the land, sweeping away soil and trees and houses in the way, and piling huge dikes and scooping out titanic gullies over the countryside. Those were the days of darkness that followed the star and the heat. All through them, and for many weeks and months, the earthquakes continued. But the star had passed, and men, hunger-driven and gathering courage only slowly, might creep back to their ruined cities, buried granaries, and sodden fields. Such few ships had escaped the storm of that time, came stunned and shattered, and sounding their way cautiously through the new marks and shoals of the once familiar port. And as the storm subsided, men perceived that everywhere the days were hotter than of yore, and the sun larger, and the moon, shrunk to 1/3 of its size, took now 80 days between its new and new. But of the new brotherhood that grew presently among men, of the saving of laws and machines, of the strange change that had Iceland and Greenland the shores of Baffin Bay, so that the northward and southward towards the poles of the earth, it concerned itself only with the coming and the passing of the star. The Martian astronomers, for there are astronomers on Mars, although they are different beings from men, were naturally profoundly interested by these things. They saw them from their own standpoint, of course. Considering the mass and temperature of the missile that was flung through our solar system into the sun, one wrote, "It is astonishing what little damage the Earth, which it missed so narrowly, has sustained. All the familiar continental markings and the masses of the sea remain intact, and indeed the only difference seems to be the shrinkage of the white discoloration, supposed to be frozen water, round either pole, which only shows how small the vastness of human catastrophes may seem at a distance of a few million miles." So quoth this raven. Well, with the astronomer Ogilvy and the Martians at the end, it looks like this may have been a prequel or sequel to War of the Worlds, which I have also done with some amazing members of the narration community. I will leave a link to that in the description in case you haven't seen it. Anyway, have an absolutely gorgeous day, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear, and comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.